good. So I'll switch to the paddle now. If the meringue gets up there before the syrup, that's better than the other way around. And all you need to do then is put it on second, so it's not quite as vigorous. Or you can even put it on first, as long as you keep the meringue in motion.
Why is that?
Because if you just let the meringue sit, it could just collapse.
Okay.
So you want to keep the meringue in motion. So here's 254. Now 310. Copper's good for all the reasons that copper's good. If you can get a copper pot, it'll just be a little bit more evenly heated. Otherwise, use the best pot you can. If it's a heavy bottom pot, it'll be all right. But if it's not, then you might start getting it caramelizing around the edges. You know, but when you get that nice heat distribution from copper, that's always the best way to go. Let's see. Where's that opening? Is that down the other end? Since the process of cooking the syrup means, you know, once it gets to 212, you're starting to evaporate the moisture, and as it gets hotter, that's just a reflection of the amount of moisture that's being cooked out of it. The rate of evaporation increases the longer that's on. So in other words, to go from 220 to 250 might take you this long. To go from 250 to 280 might take you that long. So this wouldn't be a good time to go outside and smoke a cigarette.
Jeff, have you ever tried to make it with all honey?
I did, yeah. It was a little darker than I liked.
But the texture was still...
The texture was great. The flavor was better too.
Okay.
And you know what's the hardest thing about making nougat? Getting a thermometer that's accurate.
I was going to say, why are you using that?
So you pretty quick you learn the color. It's just like when you're cooking the buttercream syrup. You know just by the thickness of the syrup that you're close to 248, right?
But you can't do honey gram per gram, right? I mean, to my tongue, you know, a gram of sugar is not as sweet as a gram of honey. You know?
Well, technically, honey's 17% moisture, more or less, so it's less sweet than sugar. But it's different types of sugars too.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
But if you made it with all honey, though, you could use the formula and substitute gram per gram, you think?
Well, no. You mean no sugar? You mean just 100%
Right.
honey?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question. That's how it originally was made.
Seems like it would be soft, right?
This is exactly why we hate cages on mixers. Don't do this too fast, or you can shock it pretty badly and deflate it. If you look at it now, it's definitely going to have an off-white color to it. And it's that gradual incorporation of air that turns it white eventually. So now is when you start hitting it with the torch. What's almost always going to happen is that there'll be some syrup that is up at the top that's getting crusty and congealed. So normally what I do is I start by heating up the top of the bowl. It's what, 48. And then that back down into it lightly. And then now and again I just feel it. And if it's super hot, then you can just leave it for a bit. You can just leave it for a bit, have a sip of tea.
Jeff, if you were going to make it at home and you didn't have access to cocoa butter, what would you do best?
The cocoa butter gives it a nice tooth. It really does give it a nice kind of, hard to really describe. The flavor in the mouth is really pretty good. And you should be able to find cocoa butter, no? So, think back a few hundred years before there was mechanical mixers. Okay, so somebody was beating this stuff over heat if they were making it this way for 15 or 20 minutes. And it's like, that's why they had an apprenticeship system.
Probably saying a catechism too.
But really, when you think about a lot of things like this, I mean, this evolved, right? This somehow is what it is today. It didn't start the first time somebody fooled around. It didn't start this way, but somebody had the idea of cooking syrup and making meringue and joining them up and all those other things. So I've always been super impressed with people who can make incredibly beautiful things, but I think I'm almost more impressed with the fact that it's one thing to make this, it's another thing to make it up, right? That's where the Nobel Prize goes, the person that made these things up in the first place. So it was originally attributed to Marseille in southern France, the Nougat, and then it went to the city or town of Montélimar, which is on the west bank of the Rhone River, a little northwest of Marseille, and that's where it's still the most famous. I think one of the things that put it on the map was in 1701, Louis XIV's grandchildren went to Montélimar and came back to Paris with 100 kilos of nougat. So that was probably a good marketing thing. That's sort of like us giving a dozen hard rolls to a restaurant account, right? One thing I usually do now, but I'm not thinking thoroughly because I'm talking, but I'll get some cold water and then you just put a little piece, half the size of a marble in the cold water and then let that firm up and that'll tell you what your final consistency is going to be. Okay, I'm going to ask somebody to please pour in those nuts. Pretty fast. Here. Okay. I don't like to do the nut part in the mixer because I think you'll bust up the nuts, which in itself wouldn't be too bad, but it'll stain the nougat part, so it won't be nice and white. Just take that thing that's a thermometer. And just dump that water and put some cold in there. Thanks. And then, while it's still warm, you want to spread it It will kind of weep, so if you don't have a form for it, then it's not going to stay nice and geometrical. So you want to keep it honest with the form. What, Mark?
I was going to say, it'd be nice if there was some form just locked in place, you know?
Yeah. So these are an inch high. I suppose you could use a rolling pin too. You could put parchment down and do it that way, I guess. That's pretty good. So there's the nougat. So it'll sit here overnight. I'll put parchment paper over it. And then, like I said, tomorrow I'll take the bars off, get it really free of confectioner's sugar, and then coat one side with tempered chocolate. Flip it when it's set, coat the other side, and when that's set, cut it.
And you leave the cut side exposed so that the white is showing?
Yeah. Yeah. That way you get to see the pretty cross section with all the nuts and fruits and things. So there.
Thank you, thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you.
And
Thank
then
you.
The only person who doesn't like nougat is the guy that has to wash.
Hot water.